Mind Talk, Step 2, Stopping Insecurity-Driven Thinking. So now that you're on your way to separating facts from emotional fictions, the question remains, especially if you're prone to incessant worry and rumination, how? How do you stop allowing yourself to be manipulated by your insecurity? Well, the simple answer to this question is best summed up by something my grandmother was fond of saying. She used to say, you can't stop a bird from flying into your hair, but you don't have to help it build a nest. From a habit perspective, you may not be able to stop an insecurity-driven thought from percolating up into your consciousness. Well, at least not at the moment. But you don't have to passively allow your conscious mind to become part of the nest-building problem. You see, this is the essence of Mind Talk's Step 2. Putting a stop to the progression of insecurity-driven thinking. Now, there are 3 self-coaching techniques that I'll be discussing in this video to help you stop this progression. And they are, 1, engaging, where you'll focus your conscious mind to actively stop the progression of insecurity-driven thinking. 2, active ignoring, where you'll be asserting your conscious mind to liberate yourself from insecurity. And 3, envisioning, where you'll learn to use visuals to actively engage your conscious mind in order to shut out insecurity-driven thinking. And once you understand these techniques, you'll have to experiment to find out which of these techniques or combination of techniques works best for you. Now, I've found that for many people, depending on the particular struggle of the moment, having all 3 methods available affords you with the best possible advantage to stop the ruminative, insecurity-driven thinking right in its tracks. So let's begin our discussion with the first approach, engaging insecurity head-on. All insecurity-driven thinking starts with what we might call a seed thought or an A thought. Maybe I can't trust him. And this may be followed by a B thought. Well, if I can't trust him, well, maybe I should get a divorce. And that's followed by a C thought. And what if I'm wrong? But what if I'm right? Okay, now you get the idea. In order to put a stop to neurotic, insecurity-driven thinking, you must learn to stop the A to B to C to Z progression. In step 1, you learned about the value of critical awareness, which now becomes your go-to strategy for actively becoming conscious enough to nip the A thought in the bud before it progresses to the B, to the C, and so on. Now you begin with the realization that although you've felt powerless to stop this runaway progression of toxic thinking in the past, it's not because you can't stop it. It's because you haven't made a focused, empowered, conscious effort to do so. You see, once engaged, your conscious mind is in a position to make the decision as to whether or not emotional fictions are allowed to dictate. Which brings us to a fundamental self-coaching principle. In order to stop the A to B to C progression, it's going to take a firm act of will. So how in the world, if you've been pummeled for months, if not years, by neurotic promptings of anxiety and depression, how do you dig your heels in and say, stop it? Invariably, the patients I've worked with who suffer from anxiety and depression have come to the faulty conclusion that they're weak, ineffective, and victims of their insecurity. They're so identified with their helplessness that any suggestion that they need to, for example, stop worrying is scorned. You don't think I've tried? I've been trying for years. You see, if what you mean by trying is to run faster and faster on a hamster wheel of insecurity-driven thinking, hoping that you can worry yourself off the wheel, then of course, The only thing that changes is, well, nothing. You see, it's not a matter of doing the same old, same old. It's a matter of doing something different, getting off the wheel altogether. Step 2 is designed to stop the wheel spinning, or running the alphabet, which will put you in a position for what's ahead in step 3. Well, you'll learn that in order to do something different, well, you're going to have to be different. But for now, your job is to stop the wheel. Not with weak or haphazard efforts, but with a consolidated focus. One that understands the pitfalls and missteps of the past and recognizes the unlimited power of your active conscious mind. The power of your active mind is to employ a very important mantra. Stop it, drop it. Now, you may not realize it, but you assert your power all the time. When, for example, you decide to get more exercise, and instead of giving in to your habit of lethargy, you make yourself get off the couch and go for a walk. You see, sometimes we have the power to take control of our out-of-control lives, and sometimes we don't. Well, how come? Think of it like the difference between a floodlight and a spotlight. A floodlight casts a wide beam of light, while a spotlight a narrow one. Then your energy is concentrated and more focused, giving you a higher probability of success. Okay, but sometimes, in spite of your intended, focused efforts to engage your mind, nothing seems to help. And you wind up actually accelerating the progression of insecurity-driven thinking rather than eliminating it. I've tried to stop worrying about my son, but the more I try not to think about him joining the military, well, the more anxious I become. Nothing is changing. I'm driving myself crazy. You see, this is not unusual, especially at the beginning when you started your mind talk efforts, where your conscious intentions to stop it, drop it, are no match for the entrenched ruminations of your insecurity. In such cases where all your efforts at engaging only frustrate you further, you need to do a 180 and try, well, doing nothing. Now, I know this sounds not only passive, counterintuitive, or even absurd, but believe me, under certain circumstances, active ignoring can be quite powerful. And the operative word here is active ignoring. I recall visiting my son, who lived in a Manhattan apartment. Listening to the chronic din of traffic, ambulances, and honking horns, I asked him, "How in the world are you able to sleep at night?" He looked puzzled, as if for the first time he was hearing the street noises, and simply told me that he didn't hear the noises. Considering the disorienting racket from the streets below, I found that somewhat difficult to believe. Until driving home that night, I realized that my son was being quite accurate. His ears heard the noises, but his brain had long ago learned to block them out. His brain learned to filter out extraneous noises, allowing him an uninterrupted sleep. Now, if you allow yourself to focus on insecurity's noise, your conscious mind will be contaminated by it. But if, on the other hand, you actively defocus or distract your mind and teach yourself to ignore the noise, then eventually your brain will learn to stop hearing it. Why? Because instead of listening to the noise and fueling the habit of insecurity, you're making that noise irrelevant. Now, I know this won't seem natural at first. In fact, it's going to feel totally unnatural. But that's only because you've convinced yourself of the myth that you need to pay attention to insecurity's distortions so that you can talk or worry yourself out of struggles. By actively ignoring, you're doing something very important. You're training your brain to no longer reinforce your habit reflex. Now understand that when you wrestle with these thoughts, you're inadvertently validating, reinforcing, and giving them life. But when you dismiss and ignore them, you're nullifying them. Now you've heard it said that a picture is worth 1,000 words. When you get caught up in the incessant chatter of insecurity-driven thinking, having a simple picture in your mind can be far more useful than 1,000 words of analyzing or trying to understand the whys of your suffering. Now, why are visualizations so powerful? Simply because the brain likes, even craves, visual images. You can tell yourself to stop worrying, which more often than not requires a tedious effort. But if you create a visual image in your mind, you will be generating a much deeper awareness and actual experience of solace. You see, when you participate in the visualization, the brain itself reacts the same way as if you're physically performing that action. So, if you saturate your brain with comforting images, you accomplish two things. One, you reduce the stress of insecurity-driven thinking, and two, you tune into your parasympathetic nervous system, often referred to as your rest and digest system. Don't underestimate the power of a visualization. So, rather than fatiguing your brain with word chatter attempts to feel better, draw it a picture. Do this and it will respond with a much deeper interest and attention that will allow you to turn away from the toxic chatter of insecurity. Now you may want to create a personalized visualization that works just for you. I've had patients offer up some rather interesting images, and one of my absolute favorites was told to me by a patient trying to stop her incessant ruminations. Imagine that you're holding a string of, say, a dozen brightly colored helium-filled balloons. Now feel your hand gripping the strings. Notice the slight tug of the balloons buoyed up by the helium. Start by releasing the string of a red balloon. Now you could pick any color, and watch it as it slowly floats up, 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 diminishing in size until it vanishes. Then go on to another color, separating the string from the others and letting go and watching it float up into the blue sky. Now doing this over and over until the train of toxic thinking is interrupted. Now whether you choose to engage, actively ignore, or envision your liberation from insecurity-driven thinking, it will depend on a bit of experimentation to find out what's most effective for you. Now there may be times where a focused, stop it, drop it, will be all that's necessary to stop the runaway train of doubt, fear, and negativity. Whereas other times, where you just can't shake yourself loose from the hamster wheel, you may find that actively ignoring will offer you, well, a more detached capacity for getting on with your outer world rather than the congested inner one. And there might be times where you need to focus on a very meticulous visualization, capable of absorbing your attention away from the feeling of powerlessness so typical of ruminative struggles. So whichever techniques you gravitate toward, these are all powerful self-coaching tools designed to systematically train your brain to starve the habit of insecurity. Now the problem has been your conscious passivity, which inadvertently allowed insecurity to have its way with your consciousness. And that's all going to change as you cut off insecurity's psychological food supply. Now always keep in mind that every attempt to actively resist insecurity matters. The effect is cumulative. you should understand that it doesn't matter whether you succeed, somewhat succeed, or fail. But what does matter is that with each effort, you prove that you're not a victim. You see, victims are powerless. You're not powerless. So once you feel you have a grasp on stopping insecurity-driven thinking, you'll be ready for my third video in this series, and that's responsive living.